rock and roll was a history book, and we find ourselves at the very end of the book, the final chapters, the final confrontation between the two protagonists. These two protagonists would be the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. Two of the biggest bands of the 60s, which is the most revolutionary decade that music ever saw. Making this video isn't really easy for me because we're taking two of my favorite bands of all time and we're facing them off against each other on a new episode of the Versus series. The way we do this is we use 4 different categories in order of importance for me: popularity, performance, influence, and discography. Based on those 4 categories, we're gonna come up with a conclusion on who's the winner of this entire video. However, I must remind you guys that this is only my personal opinion, so if you have your own, please go ahead and leave it down below in the comments and I'll make sure to check it out and give you my opinion on your opinion. I don't want to waste too much time with the intro, so let's go on with the first category, which will be popularity. And if you've seen any of the previous Versus videos I've uploaded to this channel, you know that popularity for me is the least relevant category. I don't really care how much you sold. I don't really care how many people know about you. The only thing I care about is the music, but a lot of you guys do care about popularity, and honestly, I do believe that it's a really big part of the legacy of an artist. How many people you reached with your music also feels a little relevant, so that's why I was included on these videos. And in terms of popularity, when it comes to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, I think it's pretty clear who takes the win here, because the Rolling Stones were one of the most popular bands of the 60s and the 70s as well, and they were also really popular in the 80s. However, when you compare that to the craziness and the maniac nature of the Beatlemania fans, I don't really think there's a discussion here. The Beatles obviously take the point. Honestly, even though we don't like to see it that way, I feel like a lot of the controversies the Beatles had back in the 60s with drugs, with certain comments being made about religion by John, you know, all of these things, including their massively covered breakup, I feel like that also helped the band become one of the most popular phenomenons in history overall. You know, not only music history, but, you know, the history of humanity. Actually, Paul McCartney and John Lennon are ranked among the most popular humans to ever live, and that can tell you about the popularity of the Beatles and how it overthrows the one the Rolling Stones enjoyed, even though it is pretty big. You know, I don't mean to underestimate the Rolling Stones' popularity, but I just think it's very clear when you look at the story of music and when you look at, you know, the reaction that people had when the Beatles were in town compared to when the Rolling Stones were in town, that the Beatles were way more popular. And actually today, 50 years after the Beatles broke up, they are still doing better numbers than the Rolling Stones, a band that is still going strong today, still releasing music. Actually, they released an album not too long ago, and that for me is more than enough to say that the Beatles should take the point in this category. I don't want to waste too much more time on this category, so let's move on to performance. And in terms of performance, it kind of depends on what you understand when I say performance, because for me, performance is the ability to express your feelings through the music. And in my opinion, the pure feeling of excitement and adrenaline and just raw feelings that rock and roll is known for were never expressed as well in any other voice than Mick Jagger's. And I know a lot of people say that he's only screaming, he doesn't really know that much about technical ability, Paul McCartney sings way better than him, and all these things are true. He does scream in a lot of in his songs, which makes the live performances a little chaotic when he can't do, you know, he can't scream that high anymore, or he can't control his own vocals as much as he used to back in the 70s and the 60s. I understand why people would say this. However, even though I'm willing to admit that Paul McCartney is the better singer, actually, in terms of, you know, vocal skill alone, Paul McCartney is one of the best out there in, you know, the history of music. Mick Jagger just knows how to perform a track. Actually, you only have to listen to albums like Sticky Fingers and, most importantly, Exile on Main Street. That album has a lot of songs that should be filler. I mean, the songs themselves, the songwriting, the instrumentation is not that interesting. However, through pure performance alone, through the ability to express the excitement and the raw emotions that an album like Exile on Main Street is trying to convey to you, no one has done a better job at performing a track than Mick Jagger. He elevates every single one of these tracks from just an okay track to a great track, and a great track to an almost perfect track, and you can see that in songs like Sympathy for the Devil, Rip This Joint, Rocks Off, Tumbling Dice, Ventilator Blues, Let It Loose. I mean, so many great performances, and they also know how to record it too. Like, I have to give credit to production and to the instrumentation overall, because they are great complemental factors to Mick Jagger's performance. In my opinion, even though obviously Paul McCartney can sing way better than Mick Jagger, and that John Lennon was way more influential in terms of performance because he couldn't sing that well, if you look at the quality and how much the performance that Mick Jagger delivers in every single one of the Rolling Stones tracks, especially if you go to late 60s and early 70s, you have to give the point to the Rolling Stones, which is exactly what I'm gonna do. Now let's go with influence. Now I feel like this is one of those categories where we all know the answer. Obviously the Stones were incredibly influential too, again, because of Mick Jagger's performance, because of the fact that they like to play around with dark lyrical themes in tracks like Sympathy for the Devil or Street Fighting Man, Mother's Little Helper, for example. Like, a lot of instances where the band didn't really go for the standard love, heartbreak song that blues rock was known for at the time. They also inspired a lot of artists to create a heavier version of rock music. It's still pure rock and roll though, and it's a far cry from what metal music ended up being, so I can't really credit all the influence to the Stones. I feel like the most influential thing the Stones ever did was presenting a more raw and unapologetic way to perform the music and put it out there, and people enjoyed it. It was not really seen at the time. Rock and roll was already seen as a pretty rebellious genre, so seeing Mick Jagger dance on stage, going completely nuts, the lyrics that were heavily charged with a lot of sexual content caused a lot of people to feel inspired by that and want to do the same thing, to express yourself without really being scared of what people may think of you, or if it would sell or be accepted by the people. That's, in my opinion, what the Rolling Stones represented at the very early stages of their career. The problem is we're talking about the Beatles as their, competitor, and the Beatles are literally the most important and influential band of all time. Not only because it kind of feels like every boy band after the Beatles, it feels like they were trying to replicate what they were doing with Beatlemania, but also they protagonized the psychedelic movement in the in the mid 60s with albums like Sgt. Pepper's, Revolvers, and Magical Mystery Tour, releasing some of the greatest songs from that movement, with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Tomorrow Never Knows, A Day in the Life. They did major contributions to heavier versions of rock music with songs like Your Blues and Helter Skelter, but also the variety in their albums was amazing. The fact that every single one of them performed at least one song in every single one of the records too. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver created this idea of the modern albums that were not meant to be just a compilation of tracks that were supposed to be hits, but an album that actually tries to be cohesive and stays to a certain sound, narrative, or instrumental palette. Matter of fact, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967, is considered by many magazines, music reviewers, and fans alike the most important and greatest achievement in music history, the most influential one too. So obviously the Beatles take the point in this category. As much as I love the Rolling Stones, and as much as I can appreciate all the influence they had in music, you can't compete with the Beatles and what they did in the 60s. And still today, there's a lot of artists that would say that their major inspiration was the Beatles, even if they weren't born at the time the Beatles were releasing music. The Beatles' footprint in music can be found in every single one of the corners of the industry, in artists from black metal to ambient music to folk to singer-songwriter to pop music, and obviously all the subgenres that came out of rock music. The Beatles basically changed the way the media perceived music. It was seen as an entertainment. It was seen as something to pass the time. After the Beatles, it was seen as a form of art, and this was supported by a lot of different artists. It was obviously a group effort. However, the protagonist of this movement, the protagonist of the revolutionary decade that the 60s is definitely the Beatles, and for that reason, I'm going to give the point to the Beatles in this one, and we can move on to the most important category on this video, and that would be discography. I say it every single time I make one of these videos, the one who wins this category, for me, wins the entire record, because your discography is your actual legacy, the thing you leave on this planet, the actual music, the songs you perform, performed, the music you produced, everything is packed into your discography, and for that reason, in my opinion, is the most important category. And in terms of discography, there's a few things to be said about both bands, because it is not an easy decision to make. We have the Rolling Stones that are still releasing music today, and then we have the Beatles, who broke up 50 years ago. Actually, the most recent thing we've gotten from the Beatles is a song called Now and Then, released by Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney. The rest of the Beatles basically out of a demo that John Lennon recorded in 1978, I believe. Instead, the Rolling Stones literally just released an album not too long ago. So how can you decide which one is the better one when we have such a difference in terms of, the amount of albums released? I think the right way to do it is just grab the best albums out of each discography and use that to come up with a conclusion. And when you look at the Rolling Stones at their peak, we have their incredible album run at the late 60s and early 70s, starting at Big R's Banquet, going all the way up to Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and finishing it off at Exile on Main Street. Now, this 4 albums released right next to each other is the most incredible album run of all time. No other artist, band, or group have come close to have such an amazing run of albums with such amazing quality. In my opinion, one of the greatest achievements in music history. Every single one of these 4 albums is a 10. They both portray a different stage in the Rolling Stones songwriting process. And actually, you have the great records released before this run, like Aftermath, Between the Buttons, Out of Our Heads, and then you have great records released after this with It's Only Rock and Roll, Emotional Rescue, Tattoo You, and that's pretty much where it ends for the Stones. But they have a pretty impressive discography, more than enough to battle any other discography in the music industry and give them a fair fight. The problem is that as a competitor, once again, you have the Beatles, and they have the greatest discography of all time. And don't believe me, just listen to the albums and listen to when they were released. Because it's not only the fact that all of these albums are great, it's the fact that they were released in such a short amount of time that it's ridiculous. You have Please Please Me, 1963, With the Beatles, 1963, Beatles for Sale, 1964, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, Help, 1965, Rubber Soul, 1965, Revolver, 1966, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967, Magical Mystery Tour, also 1967. We're not going to count Yellow Submarine. I don't give a shit. The band didn't really participate in this entire thing. But we have the White Album, the greatest album ever made, released in 1968, 30 tracks of pure fire. Then we have Abbey Road in 1969, and we have the final album, Let It Be, released in 1970. That means we have 12 albums in 7 years, every single one of them an amazing album. And actually, more than half of these records I just mentioned are among the greatest albums ever released in the history of music. How is any other artist, group, or band gonna compete against that? And I know a lot of people are gonna be in the comments saying, oh, there's a lot of Beatle bias on this video. And yes, they are my favorite band for a reason. They're my favorite band because I believe they have the greatest discography ever. And how can you compete with the greatest ever? You can't. Even if you were to take in the entirety of the Rolling Stones discography, which is still going strong today, I don't believe that, every single Rolling Stones album out there can match the genius of a single Beatles album. And for that reason, I think the Beatles take the point, which leads me to my conclusion. And that conclusion is, I'm pretty sure it's obvious if you watch the entire thing. The Beatles take the win in this video because, for me, man, any artist or group or band that tries to go against the Beatles is gonna lose, because not only they have the greatest discography ever, but they influence the music industry so much. And I'm not one to agree that they're the most influential ones out there. I don't believe that. I believe that people like Bob Dylan might have been a little bit more influential, especially in terms of performance. I believe that John Lennon, on his own might have matched the level of influence the Beatles as a band had on the music industry. I believe that Elvis was more influential than the Beatles. I believe that even though they're not the best at some things, when you look at the entirety of the band's discography and their performance and their influence, and when you put it all into a package, the package is the greatest thing that music has to offer. And let me put it this way, even if you were to ask me which is the greatest rock and roll band of all time, no doubt in my mind, that I would say the Rolling Stones are the greatest rock and roll band of all time, or one of the greatest. Definitely better than the Beatles. But we're not talking about rock and roll only here. We're talking about music overall. We're talking about music as a form of expression, a form of art. And when it comes to that, no one, in my opinion, did it better than the Beatles. In everything, everything they try to do, they excelled. They created something new with it. They were unique. There's nothing similar to the Beatles out there. Once you go deep into albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, the White Album, there's nothing like it out there in the music industry. And the reason for that is because they are the greatest, and you can't replicate greatness. You have to come up with it in a unique way, and that's the reason why, in my opinion, the Beatles win this video and will probably win every other versus video that I ever put them in, because there's not a single artist that can be compared to them. That'll be it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. Also, I want to know your opinion on this entire thing, so please go ahead and leave a comment down below so I can check it out, give you my opinion on your opinion, and have a small conversation in the comment section. I do my research. Again, I try to do my best. However, sometimes I can get it wrong, so if I said something incorrect throughout the video, please be gentle with me in the comment section, okay? I also want you to leave a comment if you want me to do this type of video, or a discography ranking, or just overall talk about a certain artist or a certain topic related to music. You can leave it down below in the comment section, and I'll make sure to check it out and feel free to request as soon as I can. With that being said, once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.